sharing experiences. And I think that's something that we haven't done a lot of in Web3 space, just generally. Leo, I'm going to mute you because you're...
Oh, sorry, let me mute.
Just generally because I think, it's such a nascent space that, a lot of the best practices and like the small nuances that, that I guess, in like operating Web3, right, haven't like really fully like materialized. And we're just discovering them really now, I think, or slowly over time. And, I think that's where the benefit of like sharing experiences come into place. Leighton, I don't think it's coming, so I guess it's just you and Stani. So I guess I think what would make sense is just like, probably like half an hour to 40 minutes of just like chatting and, of a Q&A that I've kind of prepared mainly, right? And, just open chat and call afterwards. Also, so Stani and Roneil, do you want to like do a quick introduction of like, who you are, what your projects are, and your worst fear at this point in time?
Yeah, Roneil, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. The quick introduction. I'm Roneil. I'm one of the co-founders of Audius, and we're a decentralized audio hosting and streaming protocol. Think like a decentralized SoundCloud. We help artists connect directly with their fans, distribute anything they want in a censorship-resistant way. We've been super fortunate to get to benefit from all of the tooling created by this community. We make very heavy use of meta transactions, among other things. But yeah, that's kind of the quick bit of it. We are really targeted at and trying to help creators who have been kicked off of other platforms and or have run into issues with other platforms in the past, which in electronic and hip hop, at least, it's basically anyone that you talk to will likely have run into these things in the past. So we launched about 6 months ago. Today we see about 250,000 folks come on Audius every month, and we've seen about 20,000 or so artists upload content so far. So it's been great so far, but it's still early days. We've still got a lot of work to do, as does everyone in this space, I guess, right? But yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, big fan of you guys, and I think there's a lot of things still to do in music and in terms of like changing the economics of music. So that's pretty cool. Me myself, I'm Stani, so I'm the founder of Aave. So Aave created very first lending protocol on Ethereum. We're actually in the blockchain, the blockchain phase in overall. So after Aave, we basically started to focus on liquidity models and launched in January the Aave protocol, which is a kind of like a money market where you can deposit and earn on stable coins, and you get in return interest-bearing stablecoin which increases in value. I mean, in the amount balance in your wallet. So kind of trying to get a user-friendly way of using DeFi. And flash loans are part of the protocol. So we try to build a narrative where DeFi is not just about putting assets into smart contracts to sleep, but actually to get them utilized more and be more capital efficient. So in terms of what we're doing in mentally is kind of like we're trying to create different kinds of money markets around DeFi ecosystem. And once we have big liquidity pools, our goal is to find out how this liquidity pools could be utilized in basically under collateralized lending by creating trust networks. So that's kind of like our thing, what we're doing. We reached today, like a few hours ago, a very big milestone. We have over 100 million market size. And this has been very crazy because we didn't expect anything like this to happen. So, I mean, it seems that if you work hard enough and people believe in you, it might actually happen that it goes this way. So we're very happy.
I still remember like you launched and it's like, yeah, we hit like 3 million, like a couple months ago. I think, yeah.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that's huge, man. Congrats.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and it's actually like a trial or error. Like it seems that we have pivoted left and right. Like we started with ETHLend, that was era before stablecoins, not enough like liquidity on collateral assets, and like it's back and forth. I think it's just focusing on what's important, and just brought us here like trying to kind of like do a nice cycle of doing something that actually works, and continuing the narrative. I mean, I hope like people are building what we built like even further and dragging it along, and we are going to this cycle with other projects. So yeah, it's interesting to see how things will evolve.
I think like we are very lucky to have you two today. I mean, mostly because it's like, because we get to maybe ask some questions around like, two projects that like almost, focus on very different problems in the Web3 space. Stani, you're really building this like, DeFi money market, right? And, Roneil, you're building this like decentralized SoundCloud, right? For artists and producers. So I think like Stani gave a good segue into like, how do you like build the right thing? How do you know you're on the right path, right? You both have, at least a couple months, or if not like, nearly, yeah, it should be like 6 to 9 months, give or take, of both of you guys, in terms of like seeing like the product launch, right? How do you build the right relationships with your users to then know like, you're on the right path?
Yes, Danny, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think one lucky thing is that our users have been followed us like over like momentarily. So some of the users have seen like what we have built previously, and kind of like seeing like progression, and they have been following it. But I think I've seen like two types of things, like where usually protocols or projects are looking into the markets and what others are doing and what basically happens there. And then you have kind of like when you focus on your users and trying to figure out like what's best for them. And this goes in terms of like the economics behind it, whether it's DeFi or basically decentralized SoundCloud, I think as well. Like I think like when you know that you are providing some value for the users and it works for them, I think it's just about expanding that user base a bit. I tend to see a lot of issues in our space is that we always look what others are doing, and like in terms of, for example, yield hacking, like trying to always like get the better like interest rates or better like terms for the liquidity providers. But it's more than that. I think it's like there's more than basically getting a better yield, and whether it's by adding more risk or reutilizing funds. I think it's about like looking at the users and kind of like what they're doing in your platform, what makes them happy, and like could this like happiness be replicated? I think that's something that has been part of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think I would largely echo that. Like, to be honest, I still don't know if what we're building is like the right thing, right? But we have users who like us and engage with us a lot, and that group is growing at a nice rate. So you sort of like, I think the one thing we did know getting started was, we basically the thesis or whatever you want to call it behind motivating us to work on Audius was seeing all of our favorite creators getting kicked off of SoundCloud. It was mostly started in like 2015 or so, right? And we just said, well, what if we could create a place that those folks could distribute anything they want, right, without having this sort of censorship machine sitting on top of them, right? And that's what led us to create this. So we had a hunch, right, that there would be looking at the data, seeing how many folks had strikes on their accounts on SoundCloud and elsewhere, that we could find a market here. But ultimately, since then, I think it's just you sort of like, to what Stani said, you kind of like start with your kernel of users, and then you try to grow out from there, right? And we're entering kind of an interesting phase as a project where we're sort of we're starting to cross from these sort of early adopter crowd into a more mainstream crowd, right? Like when we survey our users, the majority, like 80%, don't know that crypto is there. They have no idea. That group is the growing group. I think we've kind of like tapped out what we can on sort of the crypto native user side, and that's a natural progression, right? Like at the size that we are now. But I think the sort of the needs of the user change over time as you grow into like new groups of users, and you have to kind of just be very adaptive to that. But outside of that, I imagine, you know, for both of us, like what we're building in 5 years will look very different from what we're building today. And I think that's, you know, that's part of the learning process, right? You just sort of like, it's almost like you're doing gradient descent on this problem space that you've chosen to work in, and you continue to try to find, you know, new and higher heights to reach up to.
Makes sense. And I guess, you know, one thing I think most people don't understand is like, you know, you're just like kind of trying to figure this out, right? And you're seeing some, you know, signals of success, but it's like, you don't know what it looks like, you know, really later down the track. And I guess, you know, yeah, and I guess it's like the best you can do is like have these like really, these open feedback loops, right? So I guess, you know, is there a way in which you've structured your product development, you know, or have like structured your organization or your teams in a way that kind of like helps de-risk these like market forces, right? Yeah, and yeah, how have you organized your teams in this sense, I guess?
Yeah, for Aave, I think kind of like we're like as a whole team, we try to, in terms of like decision making, we try to be like, definitely there is no hierarchy in the sense like it doesn't mean that like I don't have anything, like my opinions are not like valued, but it's more about like as a founder, you always feel a bit you know, a bit of insecurity, and that's part of the game, and that's why I love what I do. But it's a fun thing is that like we try to kind of like decide by hearing as many people as we can, like internally, and value different kinds of perspective and cultures, opinions. But also like what we understood very early, that actually it's also important to hear others outside of your kind of like a team. And that's why we try to work as with many people as possible, whatever we're trying to do, and just to make sure that what we're trying to get, we basically get it right. In terms of like product development, like we are very heavily involved. Like if you are not heavily involved in Aave in product otherwise, you're pretty much like some part of the product, basically you leave kind of like a mark into it. So there's like, when you are browsing the product that you have been part of creating, you will see somewhere like, oh, that's there because I told about that. And that's like something you can show everyone. And I think that's very valuable because it basically divides the ownership of the product to everyone. And it means that more team members are involved and they care about it. And when they care about the product itself, that's when things are going to change radically. And like whatever you're building, like people will contribute. And I think one of the things that we have, we kind of debate a lot of things, and kind of like it's like I usually say that kind of like it's better that we debate and we argue and we fight than in things, because like they are so meaningful, instead of kind of like accepting stuff that would not make otherwise sense. So I think that's pretty much our approach, and it works because we're compact enough. But I would say like the future challenge is to see how to keep it this way.
So Stani, how big is the core Aave team, I guess, right?
We're 17 now in total. So it has been always pretty much the same figure. So I mean, some of the teams are like way higher, like Maker, they have, for example, or 100 employees, like are actually are like TVL, like total value locked, is pretty cool if you compare it like per employee. I think Aave is pretty high on that, but it's also like the ownership is of the product and the project is very distributed amongst the team members. Like everyone sets their footprint, so I think that has been working like efficiently. And now we have a problem that we are going to scale, and like basically this is something new for us. Like being 17 is different than being like, let's say 30 or 35. So that's something new for us.
So Roneil, how do you kind of like how has Audius kind of organized a team in a way that kind of de-risks everything with product, the market, etc.?
Yeah, I think we like the biggest area of risk for us, honestly, starting Audius was like, is it actually possible to build this thing? That was like step 0, right? And we had some little prototypes and proofs of concept when raising money, etc. But like no one had tried to do something like this, so that was really the kind of question. At least sure, it was always known that it was possible to build something that serves this use case, but whether you could get it to a level of usability that people would actually like care enough to use it, I think was sort of the unknown question. And I think we've sort of, in the last 6 months or so, we've shifted in that, like, our biggest like existential area of risk is no longer like, does the product exist and can you ship the product? But it's more like, can you continue to grow and scale a level of users on that product to meet the demand that you have, right? So there's a different kind of problem set, but both of those are very much like engineering related problems, right? And I think that is reflective of our organization as well. We're I think so we're 13 full-time. Of those, 7 are on engineering full-time. So, more than half the org. The folks that are not on engineering are either, in external facing roles like community and artist management, or myself and my co-founder now. But we both come from sort of an engineering background, right? Like when Audius was starting, it was my co-founder Forrest and I building everything, right? And as we grew in different ways, both from an org perspective and from a usage perspective, it started to make sense to shift our time to different things. But ultimately, everything we kind of we have kind of structured ourselves towards is to kind of grow via like product and engineering development. The product is sort of largely like self-growing, right? It's kind of any sort of network product like this, once you get over that initial hump of like chicken egg of like, if there are no users, no one wants to come upload stuff. And if no one's uploading stuff, there are no users. I think we've crossed that initial threshold, right? Only recently, I would say like 3 or 4 months ago, when we hit about, 100,000 monthly users or so, and like 10 or 12,000 artists, that was enough, right? That like when people came on Audius for the first time, there was like enough music that it wasn't a ghost town, right? Things like this. But when you cross over, I think those boundaries, we needed to continue to grow in the way that we had, because it's the only way to sustainably grow a network, right? If we were relying on paid acquisition or things like that, it would be a question of like, how much money can we spend? And that directly maps to how many users we have, right? But in a self-growing product where basically every user who signs up for Audius, on average is bringing in more than one user alongside of them, right? Because some small percentage of our users end up uploading content, and then they'll share that content out on other platforms, which brings more people in, and then that cycle repeats itself, right? I think that we knew that was the only path to sustainably growing a network effect around the product, and that's why we structured our org in the way that we did. So, you know, the driver of growth for us is like product development and engineering primarily, right? Yeah, I think, you know, all of that we tried our hardest to take the most sort of user-centric approach that we could, right? You know, and I think that's sort of also somewhat reflected in our org structure, in that, you know, my co-founder Forrest is head of product, and that's like full-time his job, right? Is to basically, you know, be that advocate for the user experience, right? But anyway, yeah, that was kind of a rambling answer, but that's sort of the short of it. I don't know that our like organization design was like that intentional necessarily. I think it was more, you know, we were both engineers by background, Forrest and I, who started Audius, and you know, our focus from an early time was always on that. But, you know, it's easy to come up with these narratives afterwards to justify why you do
it. Yeah. It's like, you know, you're looking back and saying, of course, you know, we did that, you know.
And maybe that's the thing to underscore, right? Is that I don't think there's nearly as much intention behind what like anyone does as you might read into it or you might think. But things naturally end up, like if you make good micro decisions, I think the macro ends up working out, right? In that, you know, we were like, well, engineering is our limiting factor on getting to market and shipping, so we need more folks on that side, right? And that small decision is what net led to the larger sort of outcome of being engineering centric as an org.
There's this like, so I'm talking to a lot of like early stage founders, you know, nowadays, and one question they get a lot from seed stage investors is really like, how are you going to solve this big problem of like, you know, getting outside the crypto space? And, you know, this may or may not apply to different projects depending on, you know, the customers, the users, the market, right? But I guess, you know, how would you kind of reconcile this question for early stage founders who are like, I'm just trying to build this thing, you know, right? And I guess for Stani, like, you have a good perspective from like just DeFi's point of view, because, you know, in DeFi, it's this big question, right? Like, you know, can we reach outside into traditional finance, or how does that even work? Will that ever even happen, right? And, you know, we're seeing like a lot of companies in the space, you know, around DeFi, such as like, say, Argent raising big rounds to go, you know, after like, you know, larger markets. We've seen, you know, say Neo Network, you know, launch a new company to, you know, go after the neobank in India, right? And we're seeing like, you know, these attempts happen, right? And I guess from Roneil, like, I guess, you know, you're really trying to target, like, you know, you're trying to take out SoundCloud, you know, it kind of like, you know, no longer serves its like, you know, core audience. And you've kind of found maybe like across this chasm of like, we found like a really loyal group. And that's like really maybe about like sustainability, or like, how do you bring it to a bigger audience, right? So like, how would you reconcile the question of like, you know, how do you break outside the crypto bubble? It's kind of like a really good question, but at the same time, kind of unfair, right? In a way where like, you expect me to answer this today, right?
But I love the question. I really love the question, because like there's two kinds of aspects of it. It's basically the early investors who basically kind of like, they see that the crypto space kind of like as a scaling instrument, and they see that the scaling could be as per like adoption, and like they're pretty much looking forward to make the things scale, and in terms of like DeFi and finance as well. But we have other perspective, is that some of the bigger stakeholders that are looking into the space, for example, the investors, they're looking and seeing like, is this like a niche that we're going to invest, or is it something that we could be scaled to billions? And I think there's like tendencies that makes in general like crypto space a bit of kind of like to put on the perspective that it could scale. I mean, in terms of like we saw with Libra and those kinds of projects, and in general, if you look at, for example, money or value, I mean, it's definitely scalable. But in terms of like in terms of Aave, I really have been like the very first goal. What we had is kind of like we want to democratize interest rates and lending markets and so forth. But we basically created a over collateralized lending market space, like with ETHLend back in the days, what Aave used to build. And one of the top arguments is kind of like, okay, but what we have here is a lending market for sure, like a money market where you get deposit and earn, but the borrowing side, the consumption is basically you get the credit line once you deposit assets into the protocol, and then you can draw a credit line. So you need collateralization. So one of the arguments is actually that, well, once everything is tokenized, basically you could use that value in the protocol. But what we're trying to now look at as a perspective, like we definitely and I think this is very important for every project out there. Like like finance doesn't live in a bubble. It really affects everyone, and it's just so layerized, and people don't see it. Like if you are depositing into a bank and you're getting a savings rate, you don't see like the hundreds of layers behind it. For example, like what the bank does with the funds, where do they invest, where it goes further and further and further. And first time ever, this clearly like composability becomes like visible because of the default system that Ethereum has, that the network is auditable by anyone, right? So it kind of like now retail and everyone can see, okay, there's this composability, different layers. So kind of like what we are doing at Aave, we have the A tokens. For example, if you deposit DAI, you get A DAI, and that algorithmically increases in your balance. So we make that process very transparent, which basically means that if you want a global savings account, you basically just obtain a DAI, either by depositing DAI or just getting it through the market. And basically, we don't live in a vacuum in a way that, I mean, we're a very centric protocol. So I believe like in the future, it will be kind of like a large, extensive money market where others are plugging in, and you have this kind of like a gateways and ramps and different user groups that are utilizing that liquidity and providing that liquidity. So kind of like our scalability is dependent on those different layers, the same way that finance is, let's say the capital is dependent on the funds and the hedge funds and the retail funds to the extent that they need it or not these days. And one thing that we focus now very carefully in terms of Aave is that now that the liquidity is growing in terms of like you deposit funds and you get the credit line, now we're thinking like how we can extend this in a way that actually you could use DeFi as a liquidity mechanism to whatever you're doing. And that will basically mean that I could actually deposit into the protocol. I got a credit line, but then I could delegate that credit line to another person or another fund or a lending institution or to a community. And what it allows us actually to do is that we're building trust networks around the DeFi, but we are getting that liquidity from a global pool. And that's like where the actually kind of like an interesting discussion comes, because that boils down to the very same discussion when we started building ETHLend back in the days, that we want to democratize the lending markets. And now we actually can do it because we have this amount of liquidity, and now we can create this trust network pools and utilize. So people can have agreements in between them when they delegate credit and basically and diversify the risk and so forth. It's very unheard of until this point, because we always think of like DeFi is this permissionless decentralized like system, but it's already saturated by the fact that you have social capital there, like with what comes with the Ethereum Foundation and what Vitalik, for example, says, or you have there, for example, USDC, which has centralized functions there. But it's all about like different layers of kind of like a spectrum of decentralization, and you can basically use DeFi in this kind of space. So I think like even we're working in a small niche, we're still always thinking the large big picture, because like if things start to go the right direction, basically we could onboard a lot of depositors from the retail sides with the A tokens, and with the credit delegation we could actually create the trust networks around. So in the future, I could imagine if someone is building a financial product in normal finance, they could actually draw that liquidity from DeFi with this credit delegation function. And that's game changing.
So Roneil, thanks for that, Stani. Super interesting. And I think like that's something like I think every DeFi founder like early on would probably want to listen to. This clip and your answer to that right there. With you, Roneil, you say you commented in the chat like you still get asked these things. do you want to share like how would you kind of like I guess how would you recommend others kind of like thinking how other founders should think about this question from your perspective?
Yeah, I should also clarify, I meant that in response to Cooper's message earlier.
Oh, right.
So yeah. So artists will still ask us like, well, do I get paid in Bitcoin? Like, how does this work and stuff? And anyway, that's I think potentially a conversation for another day. So with respect to this specific question, I think it really comes down to like, what are the metrics that you care about and that matter for your project, right? And I would posit for like a lot of projects in DeFi, like you have a 28 or whatever ETH is now, $27 billion like market addressable by a product, like that's probably big enough for quite a while, right? Before when you, I guess actually like Stani at UL size, you would start to run into some of the limitations of like, maybe there's not enough ETH actually to like be able to continue to grow, right? Which is a really weird and interesting problem. But I think for most folks, like, look, that's plenty for like a year plus of your growth. Like, it's probably not the right question to be asking. I think for a project like ours, though, it was a very important question. And it's one that we had to spend a lot of time sort of thinking about from the early days with respect to how we structure like user interactions, how we build everything, right? To build it in a way that like, you can use Audius today and not know that there's any crypto there. The majority of our users don't know that there's any crypto there, right? They get the benefits of decentralization, that is like getting to hear content that can't live anywhere else without having to like install MetaMask and write down a seed phrase and put that in their safe deposit box. And then, every action that you take in Audius is a transaction on chain. So like every time you repost a track, every time you favorite a track, every time you upload a track, like imagine if you were getting like a pop-up from MetaMask every single time being like, are you sure you want to, do this? It would cause a lot of problems, obviously, right? So we had to be really thoughtful about this question of how do we reach like a more, a non-crypto audience from day one, because we built Audius using the prevailing crypto tooling at the time, a year and a half ago. There was no path to a mainstream use case from that, right? Like we would have had to re-engineer everything about it. And it actually started with, I mean, the reason I found out about you all in the first place and like started hanging out in this community was because we use the meta transaction pattern so heavily, right? And every interaction in Audius is a meta transaction. So by doing that, and combining it with some strategies for kind of like, basically browser custodied wallet, right? So we don't have custody of the private keys of the people using Audius, but they are still, able to interact with things on chain in a trustless manner. It was just, I think we just had to be very thoughtful about how we threaded that needle, because there just wasn't a market for us that was large enough in crypto. Right. I think there are obviously like, crypto specific things like Coinbase and others that have more regular users than we do. Right. But I don't think if we had taken a crypto centric kind of approach to growth, we would not have been able to grow as quickly as we did to the size that we are now. So I think for us, it was a very important question. It was one we were asked a ton when we were getting started. And I think the best, the best answer we could give was just that, the goal here and the plan was to create a project or a product that was indistinguishable from any other like Web 2 product. You just happen to get these benefits around your content not disappearing and things like that. So that was really how we tried to approach it. But I do think for DeFi, like that's not, number of users is not necessarily the metric to optimize for. And I think that is a key insight that would lead you to build very differently, right? And I think tools like MetaMask are awesome for financial use cases, right? Like I want to be asked if someone is taking $100,000 from me, like I want to be asked that, right? But I don't want to be asked if I want to upload this track and have to click like 5 agree buttons, right? So anyway, yeah.
Awesome. So there's one other component to like building like these a Web3 startup, right? And it's really like something that everyone deals with. It's a headache of dealing with like regulations. Well, I wouldn't suggest you to offer, I guess it's up to you and Roneil and Stani to share as much as you want, right? But I'm more interested in thinking about like hearing your thoughts of how you think about navigating this area of crypto, right? How do you how has your thinking evolved over time? Do you work with regularly with legal counsel, of course, right? How does that relationship look like? Yeah,
it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm basically myself. My background is in law, so I'm a lawyer myself. But
I didn't know that. You're an EA and a lawyer, like wow.
But what's interesting is that I mean, like I've been thinking this a lot, like kind of like, because one of the things that we have in DeFi, in this crypto space, is that there isn't that much regulation, especially in DeFi, because that's something that's it's pretty much like in kind of like some extent wider knowledge, not like mass knowledge, but somewhat wide knowledge in the crypto space. And one of the things I always like try to kind of like find analogy from like the legal side is that there's many places where like I was wondering always like why it takes so much time to the regulators to basically set certain rules on how things should apply and so forth, and kind of like if the value proposition here is the actual like decentralization and like creating something new, so that I mean, because there's kind of like ability to not to have the custody of the funds and really build something new, and also like in terms of economics build things differently in terms of like the actual people who own the protocol are governing it and deciding about it. And I was thinking like why it takes so much time to this regulation to kind of like kick in. And what I think what's important is that in certain aspects the DeFi space works well. I mean, there has been few hacks and so forth, but in general, like it works well in terms of that. If things could go very badly, there is more like regulators will step in very quickly, as we see in the ICO phase. But also, like I think one of the issues, not issues, but why things are working well also is because they're super users, right? I mean, like if you look at the DeFi space and like when I'm looking at the data and doing analytics and how people are using, you have basically a user going to one protocol, then to another one, then flipping like the currencies in some place, and then like they're basically doing this a bit of like yield hacking, and that's kind of like reason that there's more understanding and knowledge. But when things start to scale a bit more and you get more people involved that are not that risk aware or understand like the protocols well enough and what's good and what's bad, then you get the problem. So like I think as DeFi becomes more accessible, or any kind of like product, like you will get those kind of like mass problems, and then you need the mass regulations and so forth. So I think it's like I would love to have more from regulators, but on the other hand, I cannot see why things are working. But I know that it's better to have regulation now than it's when it's too late.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with that. The high level comments I would give just on the topic in general around, you know, I think if you're trying to build a project or a company in this space, you have two options with respect to your like regulatory posture. It's either like move to a place where you can kind of ignore it, and or avoid interacting with certain countries that cause you problems, or develop this as a core competency within your project and your company. You can't really take an in-between approach, right? You can't kind of like, you know, be a US based project, for example, and like ignore regulation and or like sort of not really watch it, right? We've all seen the predictable results that come from that sort of strategy. So, you know, at Audius, we have the added double whammy on top of the crypto stuff of everything content licensing related, right? So this is a very, we operate at the confluence of like two of probably the most heavily regulated industries in the world. And for us, this had to be a core competency of ours from the early days, right? It was just on both sides. There are so many kind of foot gun things that you can do that like you need to be very sort of engaged with regulation to avoid. Now, with respect to like relationships with regulators themselves, we haven't spent a ton of time doing that, and I can't speak as much to that. In the case of like music licensing stuff, it isn't so much regulatory bodies that you have to worry about, but like litigious sort of actors in the space, right? So you want to kind of build relationships with them and make sure that their voices are being heard, and that, you know, you can kind of, you know, work together to work out any issues that come up and not kind of resort to litigation, right? I think on the sort of cryptocurrency, et cetera, side of things, we've been pretty fortunate that the product that we're building is, you know, falls into pretty straightforward regulatory patterns, right? So long as we don't have like a custodial solution around key management, we don't really have to worry about like most of the money transmitter and other things that you can potentially run into. But it's an active area of work for us on both sides. And I think it really comes down to like strategically choosing your direction, either of, you know, one of compliance and doing your best to be compliant and to work with folks, or you like live in I don't know, live in Singapore or something and like don't think about this stuff. I don't know as much about that path because that's not the path that we took, right? But I think you know, like Binance is probably the best example of this, right? Where, you know, they're just kind of like, oh well, we're in Malta, so like BitMEX is another example, right? So I think there are clearly like ways to go down that path, and you know, obviously those folks have moved very quickly and been able to build very successful businesses by doing that. But yeah, and with respect to how much we engage with our lawyers, Peter, which you touched on, it's like, I mean, probably more than half of my time is spent on legal stuff in my role, and I think that's sort of what it takes for this to be like a core competency of your company, right? It's kind of, you know, like my job is basically recruiting and legal stuff, you know, making sure that we have the right people coming in to Audius and filling the roles that we need to, but then making sure that we don't all go to jail also is an important, you know, an important thing too. So,
yeah.
and yeah.
Hi, if I could jump in and say a word or two. My name is Brendan Marr, and I'm from the MIT Computational Law Ecosystems and mentor for the DAO. And I wanted to say, wow, I commend you for taking on the two largest and heavily most regulated industries at the same time. This is brilliant.
Brilliant or foolish, but we'll see in a few years.
No,
But thank you.
I think it's a good thing. And you know, there's a couple things, ideas that I think are worth shedding some light on. One is what you said very early in the conversation about not having a plan and how that grows an ecosystem. And I think that's kind of important here, because you can't really plan too much here, given the dynamics and, you know, the complexity of all this stuff. So that's actually a really good strategy, because it allows you to do what's in front of you. Peter mentioned a very important thing, an important question, which is about asking the question about getting outside funding in. And I think the reality of the matter is those who are on the outside, they just are not going to have the competency to understand the dynamics and the risk associated with those dynamics that are happening internal in this ecosystem that we're building. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to be able to understand this complexity, because by the time they understand it, we've moved on to something else. And what becomes really important in all these kinds of things is the engineering of and mitigation of risk, and thinking outside of the box in terms of how you can do that with bonding curves and offering incentives to the right people at the right time. And, you know, using that as, you know, your part of one of your blades in your Swiss Army knife when it comes down to, you know, litigation and litigation prevention. Because, you know, what you want to be able to do is, you know, when things get a little, you know, fiery, okay, you want to be able to whip out your pocket, you know, these kinds of terms, in terms of, you know, you have a, you know, a bonding curve which offers incentivization. And this is all the kinds of things I hear you're trying to get at regarding, you know, your novel ways of collateralization and, you know, offloading that into other aspects of the DeFi community. So it's all great stuff. And, you know, I'd be happy to talk to you further about all these things. Great to meet you all.
Yeah, likewise. And yeah, it would be great to chat more about this stuff. Definitely curious to hear, you know, what sort of, you know, I do think it is possible for like legal strategy to be like a core competency of a company, right? And I would love to hear more about how you think about that as someone who actually works on this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I guess it's like, feel free to jump in and just ask questions. I mean, we have a venture DAO as the DAO itself after this hour has a 30-minute hangout, which you can just stay in here and hang out and chat if you want to meet other venture DAO members. It's like a no agenda thing, but you know, if you've got stuff to do, just go bounce. Right. Otherwise, it's like curious, like how do you, Stani, Roneil, like how do you stay fit, like under the chaos of like doing all this stuff?
Yeah, I think like, especially like when it comes to regulation and like kind of like and I don't know, somehow I see that there's sort of things that I don't know how to kind of like I
also,
think
by the way, I meant fit as an exercise, like as in like, you know, in terms of like just keeping sane. Like, sorry, I was trying to like lighten the mood with something more sane and human as a topic.
Yeah, trying to be more sane. But yeah, I definitely agree what was said about actually the things are very complex to many people to understand it, especially when it comes funding. So when we look at the very early guys who are entering, like it requires a lot of speciality. And as a kind of like a DeFi guy myself, like being some time around here, it's very difficult for me also to always understand what different kinds of protocols are doing and whether their incentives are actually working. They require, you know, like modeling and so forth. And I definitely agree. Like I don't see like that easy to scale in terms of funding that like everyone will understand from just by looking what you're doing, like what's the value added. So I think there is some complexity that needs to be removed. And one of the things like I recommend for everyone is to keep things very, very simple. Like like there should be like some sort of like simplicity audits, you know, for for every like startup. Like, okay, so this is your plan, this is your like whatever, this is your like growth expectation, and this is your like kind of like product market fit, like whatever. Like there should be like is this thing simple? Yes or no? Like no, basically make it simple. Yes, please proceed. So like the more simple it is, the easier it is to sell. Like even like if you have complex things, you need to have like some simplicity, like in how you function it. I mean, like that's the biggest issue for me, like the biggest issue from day one. And it's kind of like thinking like, how do I construct this whole thing here and there and make it like, and try to put all the pieces together, and like it becomes like a Lego, which isn't like a good money Lego at all. And at the end of the day, whenever you're pitching this thing, you're always dragging with it, and kind of like you feel that it becomes so complex that people just, they will skip something that if they don't understand. And now when like what we are doing is like simplifying and simplifying, it's way easier to pitch. And I keep like saying to myself, like my older self, that, I mean, okay, my younger self, that, hey, like, why wouldn't you should have done it from day one. And that's like what I really want the people take away from this, like kind of like do everything simple, like the structuring, everything, like protocol, like everything that moves, like it has to be simple. Otherwise you will be just like putting too much effort. I hope that was sane enough.
I think
I could not agree more, man. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, just say one thing on that. I think you're absolutely right. And I think doing that, it's really important to make it very, very simple for the people who it needs to be simple for, and a little bit more complex for the people it needs to be a little more complex for, and a lot of more complex for the people who can really take it, because that allows it to grow. And having that finesse in terms of exposing the complexity to different audiences is extraordinarily important, because you want to, right out of the box, be able to make it very simple for everybody. But you also want it, yeah, to make it so that, you know, everybody has a place in the ecosystem.
Yeah, Peter, to your earlier question, I don't think I stay fit for better or for worse. You know, usually my things to stay fit were outdoors related. It's kind of hard to do that now. I've been spending a lot of time up in Lake Tahoe, like near San Francisco, and that's been really good for that. But it was a bummer that we had our ski season cut short this year by all of this.
Lasse, do you want to talk about the book Made to Stick? What is it about? I literally have the download link here for anyone who wants it. Okay, never mind, mate. I guess, you know, any final thoughts? You know, any like keep building, I don't know, like founders who are, I guess, what would you say to founders right now who are like, oh wow, the world is ending? You know, it's like, you know, keep building, you know, like, yeah, I've talked to a lot of people who like wanted to start projects, but they've been dissuaded because of like the financial economic like environment, and they're like, oh, I'm sticking with my job. You know, or like etc. And it's totally sane, right? Like as a decision. But I guess, you know, yeah.
I think it's a combination of like, if your mathematical formula makes sense, like you will definitely attract people, like in terms of what you're going to do. But the other part is, of course, like many people believe you when you succeed. So I mean, convincing before that. I think it's just about like people, like founders, they need to just, if they believe and they have a very good proof on what they're doing in theory, I think it's just about trying out. And I think we're in a good society in terms of like whatever is happening around us, and we still are in the position that there's so many things that we can improve. And many things are now like, we're like, the society is changing. Like even if you see all kinds of things happening, like like it's going to the better direction. You know, people are consuming like more like like thinking more about environment and all kinds of like inclusion and everything. And I think that this is like a major opportunity. So like I think like the chances of failure is getting smaller, and there's more available capital. I will never expect raising funds back in the days, just as a college student from Finland, and basically get attracted by like actual like capital around the globe and going this far. So things are becoming more like democratized, and I think now it's a good opportunity to take chances. And yeah, and I think the thing is that I think what's interesting about like DAOs in general and decentralization is that I rarely believe that models that where you're by yourself trying to build something will work or could be scaled. I think like when you have a consensus of people contributing, like that will basically actually make the product and whatever you want to envision.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think there's there's never been a better time to be like creating something or building something from like a capital formation perspective. You know, the current situation is obviously putting a slight damper on that, but like I think if you were going to raise money before this, you're still going to raise money now. It'll just be like maybe 20% lower valuation than it would have been before. But like if you were a project that was going to be able to raise money, you will still be able to raise money now. I don't think, you know, like I think people focus on the macro and they can't control that when they should be focusing on the micro, which is what they can control, right? And what you can control is like making the best thing that you can. And if you do that, you know, eventually like the right sort of sources of capital will find you, right? So I don't know. I think, I guess the one other thought I would, you know, leave on this is that if like a bad economic situation was enough to dissuade you from working on something, I think a lot of the other shit that you would go through while trying to start a company would have very quickly dissuaded you off the path anyway, right? I think you sort of have to have a special kind of brain damage to be willing to do this and to be willing to like continue to do this, you know, for a long period of time. Because it's not always a fun thing, right? I think anyone who's like been working on a thing for a while will probably tell you that, right? But the highs are higher than anything else you've probably ever done, and if you have that special kind of brain damage or whatever else you want to call it that makes you able to sort of deal with the bad parts, you know, that's good, right? But you know, I would almost think of like a bad economy as being a good litmus test for like if that level of uncertainty was enough that pushed you away from this, like maybe it wasn't the right thing in the first place.
Awesome. Thank you both for like just taking your time out of the day, you know, for just like being here and sharing your thoughts. I think it's like really important that like, you know, a lot of this stuff, like it's non-obvious often, you know, when you're like just, you know, a couple months in, you know, building your first Web3 project or, you know, so, and I hopefully believe that, or hope so, that this series of kind of like talks and discussions can kind of like help people think about this and like, yeah, as just a stick to measure on or compare to, or just think about, food for thought. Awesome. So we just have an open hour with like venture DAO folks really right now. And I might have confused a bunch of people that the fireside chat might be happening now. Yeah, but yeah, it's recorded and we'll upload it, and you know, but otherwise, thanks for everyone for coming. I'm just gonna stick around and answer questions. I mean, like we usually have this half an hour just to chat every other week.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks all.
Keep hustling and yield hacking.
Yield hack your life.
Yeah.
So Leo, how are you staying awake? Still awake?
I'm staying awake because I think I passed the sleepy point now.
So it's
The adrenaline.
morning. You've like gone full circle on your day.
No, it's just so the exciting topics and the fantastic speakers, of course, that too.
It's a blood rushing.
I wanted to say thank you though, seriously, for both of you guys. I feel very lucky to have been able to speak with both of you and learn from your experiences as well. I think we all benefit from it. So thank you.
Oh, I appreciate you all having us, and yeah, likewise, Leo. I've gotten to learn a lot from you as well, and yeah, I think that's what's great about this community, right? Is that we're all here to help each other.
I guess Stani and Roneil, what's something that you would like to learn from other venture DAO members? I'm just curious. That might be good inspiration for like another session.
That's a really good question. I think one of the things, Peter, I've talked to you about this a bunch, but one of the things that frustrates me about the space that we are in is that the quality of content that exists around like basic, how you should be doing things as a company and as a project and whatever, just doesn't really exist, right? There's no sort of like first round review equivalent in crypto, right? And I think that sort of, you can map some of those like sort of general, like how you build a team and culture and product and everything learnings from like traditional company building lore into like crypto, but not all the things translate super well. So I think, there are some specific topics within that I would be super excited to hear from other folks around, like, how you've managed relationships with exchanges, paths to like liquidity in tokens, what the dark world of like market makers looks like and whether you should just stay away from it. I've heard so many conflicting things on all of those questions, but the most frustrating thing is that people don't ever talk about them openly, right? They only talk about them privately and one-on-one. And maybe that's just part of the game, right? But I do think it means that, folks, I've been fortunate that I have like, friends in this space that I can ask these questions to privately. What bums me out is that like that makes our community that much harder for like new people to join, right? Because you don't just get access to this knowledge. You have to really like kind of go find it.
I would just say that that's one of the exciting things about crypto, and that you get into it to pursue knowledge, but most people are very open to responding to your questions, at least in my take.
Very true. I found the same thing for sure. But it's kind of like it took me quite a while to like make enough friends in the space to kind of like even be able to route those questions, right? Because you don't know who the person in the world of people who might know the answer to a given question is, right? And that's what groups like this are great for too, I think, to be fair.
Yeah, getting
or
through the spam filter is nice.
Yeah.
Or even what is the question, right?
True.
It's definitively different without the conference circuit for sure. So this is fantastic.
I'm going to call on you. You just joined. What's something that you'd like to learn from other venture DAO members that we can perhaps like create content on, or like just bring out into the open?
Who's you? Me?
Amin.
Hey, good morning. Just trying to think about it. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff you guys know that I don't, like how to run a venture fund, for starters. Several of you, but yeah, I think the thing that I'm most interested in learning is from like the broad diversity of experience that the other like founders have, like what's up at Audius, like how does that how's that going? Like, like what does that bring? Like, how does that shape your intuition for like other projects in the space? Sort of like the hive mind thing is the most interesting, because there's always going to be somebody that knows something that I don't, about some new emerging awesome project. I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, that's as good as it gets. I mean, there's no right or wrong, right? I mean, yeah, I think like one of my personal selfish goals is, I don't know, like my goals is just like, yes, Venture DAO is like kind of this entity that's trying to like invest, but like I want it to be like this platform that like can create like more like that can bring more information out about like building like a Web3 startup like out into the open, and just kind of like help like kind of help the ecosystem build the right things, right? We have all these people building. Ideally, everyone builds something useful. The more useful things we build as an aggregate, it's like, or it's like a what's it called? Like a tide. Like what's that saying? The tide and boats thing.
Rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah, in a way, right? It's like the more we can learn from each other, it's like a positive feedback cycle. And yeah, and I think it's like, I guess it's like that's the start of like just bringing in knowledge out from like Venture DAO. Like for Venture DAO, for those who aren't in it, I mean, we've basically spent the last like 2 to 3 months just like getting our ops into place and getting going into the, like basically making our first investment and just like going through the motions of like setting up a DAO and the org and like getting the social norms in place, right? And now we're kind of like able to kind of focus more on like, okay, what projects we, what founders can we support? And, how do we like kind of bring out more information, and help the community grow alongside everything else.
Yeah, just to add that, because I've spoken to some of you, part of that process of just kind of, the secret sauce for me of Venture DAO is the knowledge sharing and the group decision making ability. So if we can sort of nail that, then it becomes far more powerful, and that's what I've been trying to do, is just get around everybody and just a bit of a stock take of who knows what, and I'm sort of halfway through that, and then we can share that with everybody, and we've got a good sort of foundation point where we can go, yeah, this person knows this, and I think that will be an evolving thing. And yeah, I'd really love to put in place some sort of system where people can update, have some sort of place where they can update stuff that they know and or want to share, and people can just go to some. I'm not quite sure what that might be, but yeah, I really want to make that sort of a better system and build on what we've got now.
So I have a question about Venture DAO. So what sort of projects are you looking to fund? Like, are you looking for more like infrastructure plays, and what or like DApp plays, and what stage do you expect these projects to be at by the time you're ready to fund them?
It's a good question. I guess just taking stock generally, we have a lot of different people working in different areas in the DAO, and during the daytime, day jobs, main gig, right? And because of that, I think we can like fairly, like I guess I can also go through like the process of how we like invest into a project, right? Now we've gone for once and maybe twice now. But generally, like we want to really work with like projects at the pre-seed stage, when a team is just getting together, it's plan, really understanding like what product we want to build, and maybe several months out from like going to market, right? Or half a year, etc. And we're looking to work with teams as early as possible, to be honest. And I guess what the process looks like is really like someone within the Venture DAO really gets a hold of someone finds a lead. Like basically, if you want to get investment from Venture DAO, the best person is like go to our website and you'll see all the list of members. And then you can kind of like I guess find them on Twitter or Telegram, right? And try to I guess really it's like you're trying to get the cosign, I think, right? You're trying to convince them that this is a worthwhile project to bring to the table, into the community within Venture DAO, right? And after that, if people are interested within the internal Discord discussion that we use, it's brought to larger discussion, and people discuss it. It's discussed in the forums, and I guess we do soft after, if there's a decent sentiment around like, whether we should be help working for a project, we then take it and we soft signal it across the entire DAO. And then after that, after further due diligence, depending on various timelines, we make a vote on chain to make the investment.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense.
But it's been very referral based. So like, I mean, like, yeah, everyone knows, everyone's kind of tapped into different networks, right? So yeah. We're also really down to like try out new things, like I really want us to like buy crypto art. And I think like the magic here is like getting together a proposal to buy some crypto art. Like just, why, like I don't want us to have like this boring ass website with a bunch of like text on it. I want us to like flex about crypto art when you land on it. And
yeah, I wanna build like a sorority house on crypto voxels for Meta Gamma Delta, and like have display some cool art there.
Yeah, I mean, like if you can figure out a way to like make it sustainable, like I don't know, like of course like loan, like to build this. I don't know, like we're pretty open to anything, right? I originally was exploring, there's a lot of dApps in the ecosystem that are actually generating revenue from like $5,000 to $10,000 a month on a monthly basis, right? And they don't really have a core product native token protocol, like kind of like business model, right? But they do need funding, and I've floated with the idea of like providing revenue-based financing, just on like the basis of like like revenue share and loan-based investments, right? With like capped multiples. But the issue there right now, at least with venture DAO, is really like the tax implications of like, we have a bunch of ether, we got to sell it into DAI, right? And yeah, I think, I mean, like if we have a bunch of DAI, then like, I think that might open up like the possibilities of like, some of these like cash-based like, revenue and like loan-based investments.
So what is the, like, for DAOs, what is the taxable entity?
Yeah, so we have a Delaware LLC called MetaCartel Ventures DAO, and that's kind of like the taxable entity. It's pass-through, so it's pass-through to all the members. So like we have to be very careful about like, not putting a bunch of tax liability on our members, and that's mostly by like, like when we sell ETH to DAI, etc. And
yeah.
Leo, what is something you'd like to learn from the rest of Venture DAO? By the way, for other Venture DAO members who've just joined this call, we already did the Fireside chat, in case, I confused you. And it'll be recorded, so yeah, it's recorded.
Yeah, I just want to point out that